The UK and Germany also say they're seriously concerned about reports of North Korea sending troops to Russia. The UK's Defence Secretary called it a potential escalation. Both countries have signed a pact to boost European security amid what they say is rising Russian aggression.
We are checking the implications with regard to international law at the moment, but anyway, it is a new quality in that war we have to deal with. I don't know what is really the advantage they promise each other by doing that. I mean, we don't even know whether we are talking about 1,500 or 12,000 or which kind of soldiers are coming to Russia and to fight where and against. I don't know that. I know whether you have other information, but in any way, it is a new quality. It is a kind of escalation, and it shows us a very important aspect. International conflicts are approaching very rapidly. North Korea providing ammunition, weapons to Russia. Russia providing on the way, likewise, technical systems and oil and gas and so on, does have an impact, for example, for the security of South Korea. North Korean actions have an impact on North Korean and Chinese relationship. This on this side has an impact for the relationship between China and Russia and India, and China and India and Russia. So we see international conflicts are getting more and more closer to each other and linked to each other, which makes it not really easier to deal with them and to get an approach for de-escalation and for respecting finally multilateralism in our world. So I'm quite concerned about that development.
I share that very serious concern about the reports of this development. We both totally condemn this as a potential escalation, as Minister Pistorius has said. It looks highly likely that North Korean troops have been deployed into Russia. It is certainly not clear yet that they've been deployed to the battlefront. We know that North Korea have been providing weapons and ammunition to Russia. I see this as a sign of, in fact, desperation, as well as a shocking escalation on North Korea's front, a desperation from Putin that he's having to reach out and develop a growing alliance of aggression with a country like North Korea. And Minister Pistorius is absolutely right. This is not just a concern about the potential for an escalation of conflict in Europe. There is an indivisible link with security concerns in the Indo-Pacific as well, and that was one of the areas of discussion for Minister Pistorius and I when we met last week as defence ministers at NATO in Brussels.
Well, for more on these stories around Russia, including the visit of the UN Secretary General to Moscow, and of course a reaction to North Korea sending troops allegedly to Russia, I'm joined now on the line by the European Affairs analyst, Dr. Marek Laskiewicz, who's been monitoring developments from London. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Let's start with the UN chief, Antonio Guterres. He's apparently received a warm welcome at that Brics summit hosted by President Putin just outside Moscow, but Ukraine predictably has condemned the visit. Do you agree with Kyiv that it undermines the UN's reputation?
The problem is that the UN turning up there means that he is accepting this summit and has accepted that it's important, and that therefore the Western narrative that Russia is an entirely guilty party and that Russia must be punished is by definition weakened. On the other hand, it would show that the UN is trying to be even-handed, which is very useful in a world which is rapidly becoming an us versus them. And in that case, the UN visit, whilst it undoubtedly means the UN is no longer 100% on the West side, has its good aspects in the sense the UN might be able, therefore, to broker some sort of peace.
That's a very good point, especially the second part of what you said, because essentially the UN should always be seen as a balanced, honest broker, shouldn't it?
Yes. What Kiev is demanding is that everybody is on its side 100%, agrees with all its views 100%, and supplies 100%. However, in this sort of war, which, I repeat, could escalate eventually into World War III, having someone who is, so to speak, neutral, and the UN historically is supposed to be just that, is actually a good thing for the world. So whilst Kiev is correct in its analysis, it is wrong, we would be wrong to condemn it from the point of view of everybody else.
Nevertheless, from the point of view of Vladimir Putin, I mean, looking at the optics of this Brics summit taking place, and given the competition between Russia and the Western world, and Western attempts to isolate Moscow, I mean, what's your assessment of what this Brics summit that's attracted top leaders from around the world to Moscow means for Vladimir Putin?
It's a stunning success. To be quite honest, he has managed to conjure up a conference which is equally as important, equally as valid as anything as the West has done. And it shows that essentially Putin, far from being a beleaguered leader of Russia, far from it. Russia has many half allies, people at least willing to talk to it, to deal with it, to comply commerce with it. And not only that, that's looking at Brics, this conference, simply as point of view of what it means for Putin as it stands. But there's a real sting in the tail for the West if, as a result of this conference, they succeed finally in developing an alternative currency to the dollar, which is, of course, the big question now.
Well, absolutely. Obviously, that's going to take some time, but I agree with you. I mean, the idea, the concept is likely to make a number of people fairly uncomfortable in the Western world. Meanwhile, of course, the US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has added his voice to allegations of North Korean troops in Russia, presumably on their way to Ukraine. I mean, we can't be sure, but Mr. Austin said the evidence was there to show that North Korean troops were in Russia, but it remained to be seen what they're doing there. Do you think North Korea is preparing to fight, or perhaps already fighting alongside Russia in Ukraine?
Well, this is a very interesting point. There are two aspects to it. First of all, when Macron of France says he's going to send French troops to help train Ukrainians, no one bats an eyelid, of course, because this is us. But when they do it, that is to say, Kim of Korea sends troops, it is, of course, a heinous crime. It's precisely this sort of rhetoric from the West that so annoys other nations, because it's essentially sources only for the gander, not for the goose. What the North Korean troops will do is indeed an open question. If they are only there as a support function, then plus minus, they're doing the same thing as what the French and what others have proposed. If, on the other hand, they're going to take their part on the front line, it is therefore an escalation. So the fact they've joined is an escalation, but in a sense, it's no more than the West was contemplating or has done to some extent. But if they take part in the fighting, that will be an enormous difference. One of the points is the Western leaders keep saying Putin is desperate. There's nothing desperate about it. He's making use of allies, as indeed in World War I or World War II, the West made against Germany. So therefore, from that point of view, far from being desperate, it gives them a very real opportunity of winning the war in Ukraine.
Well, let's delve a bit deeper into that, because, I mean, understandably, Ukraine has become pretty nervous with all this talk. And it says, along with South Korea, that they have evidence that North Korean troops are in Russia, and some of them may well be in Ukraine. Kyiv says there could be up to 12,000 North Korean soldiers. There's been talk that Russia, I think you hinted on that, is having manpower issues after 2.5 years of war. In that regard, what difference might 12,000 North Korean troops make?
Well, for a start, I don't think it would stop at 12,000 because it's really the thin end of the wedge. So therefore, once they're in there, have been accepted, then change them from 12 to, say, 40,000 is just a matter of logistics. No one's going to bat an eyelid anymore. So I think that's the main point to consider. Secondly, the attack now taking place on the key front, in Pokrovsk, is now nearing the point where with extra troops, the Russians, actually win there. And this would be quite a substantial gain. The 12,000 troops in themselves would therefore represent just that extra effort needed to just take the town and also to carry on subsequently. Therefore, the 12,000, assuming it is as much as 12,000, is in fact important, both in the sense of being an initial force and in the sense of being perhaps enough for that final push.
And what is there? I mean, what benefit is there for North Korea? You know, I know they signed an agreement, a strategic sort of cooperation agreement, but I mean, if North Korean troops are going there, some of them possibly to die, I mean, what would be the benefit to North Korea?
Oh, there's at least three. First and foremost, Russia will be paying for it in terms of raw materials of some sort. So they're not, how can I put it, just going there as a freebie for Russia. Number two, the really key one is, are there any secret clauses concerning South Korea? You see, one of the problems is it could be like a Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, where it all is not written on the surface, and it could be that subsequently Russia will help North Korea against South Korea. And finally, there is the point that for North Korea, the hermit kingdom, the kingdom does nothing outside, is suddenly taking its place on the world scene. That in itself is an astonishing diplomatic coup in a sense for North Korea. Please remember, it has been isolated and to a degree self-isolating for years, and suddenly it's on the world.
Indeed. Meanwhile, of course, the war in Ukraine continuing, whilst the rest of the world has been focusing so much on the Middle East. What is the latest in that war in Ukraine? I understand the situation on the front line is quite challenging for Ukraine.
Yes, very much so. The central problem is the Kursk incursion was a mistake. It split the Ukrainian forces and left them weakened to deal with the steady Russian advance. And it is a steady advance, but now with the North Korean troops, assuming they'll take part, they could overrun, quite possibly, some Ukrainian positions. One of the problems confronting Ukraine, you said the word challenging, quite right, I will go a step further. One of the problems with Frontlines is, if they collapse, and this has happened, it could be quite substantial. This is what happened in World War I, where Germany held its own for years and years, and suddenly on August the 8th, they just cracked because the British broke through with tanks. And here comes the same point here. The Ukrainian people are tired of the war, and simultaneously they're being stretched, and there's winter ahead. So it is indeed a very challenging time, and we hope the Ukraine can, in fact, survive it.
And just before we let you go, Dr. Laskiewicz, just returning to that top line that we started with, which is the potential benefit to Vladimir Putin of this Brics summit in Russia. Is this evidence, as Moscow says, that Western efforts to isolate Russia over its invasion of Ukraine have failed?
Yes, but not only that. It's come into the open. If you remember over the years, I have been pointing out that Russia is not isolated. There's a great many half allies, hidden allies. And now what has happened by the Brics conference is it's come into the open. The Western narrative is not fully accepted in the rest of the world. And this is a stunning diplomatic coup for Russia, strengthening it in every respect. And to be quite honest, it's a setback. I mean, it's not just for Ukraine. but for the West and even for America, because out of this conference, out of more closer cooperation could emerge a very real alternative, a very real competitor to the West.
And that's a very interesting point. I know I said I'd let you go, but you make such good points that I have to kind of, take the discussion just a little bit further, because, I mean, all the countries that make up the Brics have some form of, I don't know, loggerhead or at some form of loggerhead with, I mean, you've got Brazil, not so much Brazil and South Africa and possibly India, but certainly China and Russia. And the Brics is a group of countries and emerging economies that see themselves as a kind of counterweight to a Western-led world. So you could say that their coming together like this is a kind of challenge to the political and economic dominance of the West.
Quite right. What is happening is that Russia has now for some time been stressing it wants a multipolar world, as indeed China says, as indeed India says. Actually, it kind of becomes more bipolar than multipolar, but that's a detail. The point is that it's quite clear that the hegemony of the West, primarily of America, is actually being subtly challenged here. And if India and China could resolve their differences, then therefore there could be a very serious competitor. As I said before, one of the little details that has emerged, which is very significant incidentally, is India and China have agreed to de-escalate the frontier tensions. This is the sort of detail that makes all the difference. Please remember, about 2002, what Putin did was came to terms with China about the frontier. This was such a significant move. No one much noticed it because it was done without much fanfare, and yet it's one of the most significant diplomatic efforts. If China and India do the same, then we really have a situation where the whole of Asia is more or less in concord, and therefore, far from being isolated, Putin and the notion of a multipolar world certainly is very much strengthened.
Well, it's a fascinating discussion, and particularly the possibility that, ironically, Russia could now be at the heart of helping to shape a new global order. I want to thank you very much indeed for your sort of abiding patience and sticking with me there while I sort of came up with all kinds of questions. Dr. Marek Laskiewicz is a European affairs analyst, and he was talking to me there on the line from London. Thank you very much indeed.